Hi, this is the Apprenticeship Hub podcast. I'm Vicky and I'm here with Rachel today, and we're here to talk about endpoint assessment. So Rachel, first of all then, what is an endpoint assessment and how does that work?
So endpoint assessment is when you are on an apprenticeship programme, you will have done at least a minimum of 12 months of quality training with your training provider for your apprenticeship training. At the end of that 12 months period where you have learnt all the skills, knowledges and behaviours that you need for that apprenticeship programme, you will then have a meeting with your manager, yourself and the training provider, the person that's been doing the training with you from the training provider. You'll sit down and have a meeting called your gateway meeting. That gateway meeting is where you all voice your opinion basically of whether you feel that you are then ready to progress on to the endpoint assessment elements of the qualification. At that point, you will all put your thoughts forward of whether you feel that your manager will give you feedback, the training provider and yourself of whether you feel that you've developed those knowledge, skills and behaviours that are required to allow you to complete that endpoint assessment and get a good positive outcome from it.
So it's a joint decision then?
Yeah, so you'd never go through to endpoint assessment if any of them three parties didn't feel that they were ready, because it's part of you would be setting that person up potentially to fail, which you don't want to do. On a money side of things, your employer is obviously probably finding the money for that qualification. The training provider doesn't like failings because and setting people up to go through when they're not ready, because that doesn't look good for them as an employer, as a training provider, to get failed apprentices going through. And as an apprentice, that's not a positive assessment process to go through and fail something.
No, you want to be ready if you're going to go through to that.
Absolutely. If you're going to go through them assessment processes, you want to be fully prepared and ready. So that gateway appointment is to establish that, to make sure everybody is ready. If it's established in that meeting that everybody is ready for that endpoint assessment process to begin, you would then get sent over to the endpoint assessment company. So the training provider is one company, then the endpoint assessment company is a separate company.
Right, okay. How do you pick who that company is then?
The training provider that you work with will have worked alongside the employer to decide who the endpoint assessment company is. A lot of training providers will have sort of a preferred endpoint assessment company, but actually it is up to the employer who they use for that assessment to take place. But it will have been agreed back right at the start of the apprenticeship programme in the apprenticeship agreement document.
Right, so the apprentice and the employer will have known well in advance who it's going to be and where they're going to be going for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that assessment process isn't different depending on which assessment person you use. Yeah. So the assessment process is the same, even though you might use, people are using different endpoint assessment companies. The assessments are the same because that's what's actually that's stipulated as part of the apprenticeship standard of what the assessments are.
Okay, so what types of things would take place then during the endpoint assessment? Would that be like a test or how would that work?
So all different things depending on which standard that you're actually working through. When we think with an apprenticeship, you're going through from a level 2 right through to a degree. So the things that are going to be required of you in them assessments are different. And every standard, I do not know them all. I will happily tell you I do not know every endpoint assessment.
So I'd be very impressed if you did know them all.
Some of the ones I'm most familiar with are some of the standards that I used to deliver. So if I use them as an example, so I used to deliver the level 3 business administration, which is a standard that's really readily taken up across the UK. For that endpoint assessment process, you would be undergoing a professional discussion using your portfolio of evidence, which is evidence that you'll have been generating throughout your programme to demonstrate your skills, knowledges and behaviours. You then have what's called a professional discussion about it, which is a structured discussion about the evidence in front of you. You'll also have those assessment criteria with you all the way through your apprenticeship. So nobody's going to jump a question about you that you don't know. You've got it there, you've got the criteria, you'll have prepared your discussion and your evidence with that criteria in mind. No secrets in apprenticeships is what I always think is good. You do a professional discussion. You also do an online knowledge-based test, so like a multiple choice test.
You've got your portfolio of evidence as well to support that, so is that used at the end as well?
Then with some other elements, so that they would be 3 elements to your endpoint assessment. And they would be all laid out for you, so they'd be planned. So when you had your gateway meeting and then you were progressing on to the endpoint assessment process, your training provider will basically send your paperwork to the endpoint assessment company through a very careful, secure process and say who you are, where you are, and that you're ready for endpoint assessment. They will then contact you and your manager, mentor, and set up a meeting to plan how that endpoint assessment is going to take place. So they'll come and do a meeting with you and explain exactly when they're coming, what they need you to see, what they need you to prepare, what's going to happen on what date, at what time, so you know exactly when them elements of your endpoint assessment are going to take place.
So as an apprentice then, you've got lots of time to prepare and you know exactly what you're preparing for. And does the training provider support you as well to make sure that, once the training's finished, does the training provider still support you to get you through that in that period of time?
So what the training provider will do before you actually get to endpoint, to get to that gateway meeting, they will have made sure you're ready to get to that gateway. They'd never call that gateway meeting if you weren't prepared. Usually a training provider will offer you mock assessments. So like you'd do a practice test or something like that. You'll do the same things, but with an apprenticeship. And I was a trainer that the role that I used to fill, they were the part that were really helpful to take somebody through to the end and then be able to sit with them and say, right, we're going to do your mock interview today. We're going to look at your portfolio. I'm going to actually grade these like I'm the endpoint assessor. And then we're going to go through these processes to familiarise yourself, because once you've done it once, it's much easier the second time. And they're also doing it with the person that they've been with for 12 months doing the training, so they're familiar.
Yeah, and they're comfortable in that situation.
Yeah, to get that practice go out of the way. And then the training provider will then also, that trainer will provide feedback. So if they think they're achieving a pass, they'll give them feedback of how they might then achieve a distinction instead. Or if they're maybe not quite at a pass, they'll support them to see where they could get to that pass rate instead. So that they can then absolutely maximise what result they get at the endpoint assessment.
Oh, so at the end of the endpoint assessment, there's different grades as well. So is it pass and distinction, are they the two grades then?
Yeah.
Oh, right,
so
okay.
There is the other one that people don't like to talk about,
which
beginning with F, fail.
Fail. What happens if they do fail then?
So if somebody was to fail an endpoint assessment, it does vary very generally. This is a general overview because it does vary on every standard. So if you were to fail one element of that endpoint assessment process, you'd usually be allowed to then reset just that element. And you'd just, the other two assessments you'd have passed, for example, if there was 3 and you just failed 1 and didn't meet the pass mark, you would achieve your marks for those 2 and then retake that one that you didn't achieve the pass mark on. Okay. If, for example, you failed all 3 elements at that first assessment, it is unlikely that you will go straight through to reset them. Yeah. Especially if your results are not close to the pass marks, because it's demonstrating that you're not ready for endpoint assessment. So then at that point, what would happen is you would go back from the endpoint assessment company back to the training provider, and the training provider will do further training with you, and then you'd re-complete that gateway assessment and then go back across for endpoint.
If you fail at the endpoint assessment then, does the endpoint assessor, do they send feedback and instruct kind of what it is that you failed on, so that you can prepare then again for the next set of endpoint
they will give feedback at the end of the assessment to the apprentice and to the mentor manager, whoever's present at that time. They'll give feedback on what the pass mark was, and like a driving test. So, you get your driving test and they give you a result of where your minors and your majors were. It's a similar process. They'll say where you've missed and what you need to do to take it to where it needs to be. And they give a full comprehensive report after that as well. They give a result on the day of the assessments of what has happened with that particular assessment. And then I think it's a week after that they actually have got to then provide a full written report on that assessment process.
All right, okay. So that'll be at the point then. So if there has been that kind of the 3 fails and it goes back to the training provider, they'll use that report then to make sure that they can kind of cover those off so that they're ready again to go back.
Yeah, absolutely.
From a business's point of view, is that, what does a business need to do? How can a business support an apprentice to get ready? What's that side of it from the business's perspective? So
from a business's point of view, they're actually provided with a endpoint assessment pack, which actually helps. They need to read through. It's what's expected of them as an employer to support the apprentice, what they need to provide, such as the assessment place. So if you don't go to a college, for example, then your training might have all taken place in your workplace. So that when the endpoint assessment is going to take place, it's an assessment. So it needs to be like you're doing an exam. So it needs to be in exam conditions, so that you're not going to be disturbed and things like that. So on the dates that these assessments are going to take place, the employer needs to make sure these places are available to do this in, and that also the apprentice is going to be available for that as well. Yeah. And also on the other side of it is just giving them the time that they need to prepare, supporting them, possibly offering them to do a run through with them. Every apprentice has a mentor assigned to them as well as part of their contract. A
mentor within the workplace.
Yeah. So it might be saying, let's give you some time with your mentor. Let's give you some time, some support. That it's not all about the assessments. It's sometimes about building somebody's confidence or supporting them and giving them encouragement around it, dealing with any of the worries and fears about it. So giving them that time with the person that they feel comfortable enough to talk to that about, to prepare them ready for it. And I would say from an employer point of view, just ask them what they need. Yeah. So every apprentice is going to be different. Some people are going to be like, yeah, I'm fine, I'm going to absolutely nail this, no problem. And others will be really worried and really stressed. So have that conversation with them and see what they need and see how you can support them and get them through that process.
That's good. It's interesting actually that you said that. I'd assumed that because there was like an endpoint assessment organisation, I'd assumed that there'd be like centres that they all had to go to, but it's quite interesting that it can actually like be in the workplace, and I suppose that might ease any kind of nerves as well, because you're not just having to like going back to school and having to go to like a test centre to do something. So it's quite good that they've got that option as well.
Yeah, that they do it in a familiar environment, which I think sometimes helps, because then they have to welcome the endpoint assessor to the site and kind of like, hi, let's get you signed in and all that sort of stuff. So sometimes they go a bit into work mode a bit more, which can then distract them away from actually what they're doing, and then be like, right, let's get you a coffee, let's sit down, these types of things. And it kind of gets them into that role. And
helps with that mindset then.
Rather than, oh, where am I going? Can I find where I'm going? I'm not going to be able to find the centre or anything like that. So there's not to say that some standards don't have that, where they have to go to centres and things like that. But in some cases, it will be all placed in the workplace. Literally, the endpoint assessor would bring a laptop to do the online tests on. Yeah. They'll sit and do the interview with them and things like that. So, yeah.
Oh, that's perfect. Right, is there anything else, or have we covered everything off?
I think that was it.
Right, lovely. Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right, thank you.